Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cuplet Fern, Floridian Plant Society. My name is Mark. I have the greatest pleasure of having this program with Jennifer Possley from Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden. Let's go over our announcements really quickly, and then we can hand it over to Jennifer. So, welcome to Cuplet Fern. We are a chapter here in Seminole County of the Florida Native Plant Society. Our conservation, preservation, restoration of Florida native plants and native plant communities is our mission. As you probably know, we made it into yesterday's New York Times. We can actually paste a link for it into our chat box so you all can check it out as well. But we've been doing our publicity for years, and this is just a testament of how far our publicity and reach is and how effective it can be. So a big thank you to the New York Times for them to pick it up and publicize it for us. And it was a very pleasant surprise for us as well. This video will be available on our YouTube channel, so please go ahead and subscribe. It is in the event page as well as in the live stream comments. So we will paste this link again for you. Please go ahead and subscribe. It's free, and it is a great way of showing your support for Cuplet Fern. So we appreciate you subscribing to our channel. There is a winter in Florida, but in case you are from out of state, you'll be surprised to hear that we still have flowers that are blooming, although not profusely blooming, but they are present here in Florida. And it's another good reason for us to plant native plants because they do sustain wildlife throughout the year. There's a common misconception that we must plant non-native or high productive non-native plants to sustain wildlife even in the winter time, but it's not true. For example, on the left, we have kunti, which is a great fruit for birds in particular. Coreopsis is blooming right now, interestingly enough, but not profusely as it will in spring. Scorpion tail is still around for the bees and wasps that are, managing through the winter. We have silkgrass, we have Stokes aster, we even have spotted bee balm, Monarda, in bloom. So even though they're not blooming profusely, there's still a few flowers out there for bees to utilize should they be out in the winter. And again, another reason to continue planting native plants in your locale. Our upcoming presentation is on January 17th with Laura Zuro, and this will be regarding winter and native bees. So it's a very timely presentation. It's a casual chat. Many of us are taking advantage of the cooler weather here in Florida, notorious for humidity. But during the winter, it cuts off and we can actually get out in the garden and make some progress. But does that interfere with bee habitat and bee behaviors? So tune in. Let's see what Laura Zuro has to say. She is a bee specialist, and that's next weekend at 2:30, and it's free on Facebook and YouTube. Gardening and Florida's beautiful moths. That's the following weekend on January 24th. And that's at 4:30 through 5:30. It's on YouTube and Facebook. This is another webisode, a casual chat between Jennifer Hopton Villalobos, Kaylee Adams, Gia Ekdahl, and yours truly. We'll be talking about how do we navigate in the garden and interact and know these beautiful moths. Some of them are quite dangerous. They have stinging, characteristics, for the lack of a better word. So how do we navigate around that? Some may be extremely beautiful, some are harmless. So let's find out a little bit more about Florida's beautiful moths. We do a lot of emphasis on Florida's beautiful butterflies, but there are some astonishingly beautiful moths out there as well. And February 6th is gardening and uncommon South Florida plants. I think Jennifer will be smiling out here. So we'll be touching base on South Florida plants, which have a markedly different representation here in the continental United States as opposed to even Central or North Florida. So in case you're curious about what kind of native plants are found in South Florida that are used in gardening as well as landscape applications, tune in with Gili Ecto. And this is February 6th from 4:30 to 5:30, again, free on YouTube and on our Facebook channels. And come grow with us or simply support us. Cuplet Fern is very, very active, and membership is your ultimate show of love and support, no matter where you're from. It could be even out of state. We do events, workshops, community gardening, field trips, virtual learning, internships. We're known for our mentorship within our chapter, environmental study areas, plant sales. And the best way to go about this is go to fnps.org. You'll find a button called Join, and then select Cuplet Fern from the dropdown. And again, like I said, your membership is your ultimate show of love and support, no matter where you are in the world. Student, individual, household, and even business level memberships are available. And tonight I have the greatest pleasure of introducing Jennifer Possley to you all. She'll be discussing fern basics and ferns of Florida. Jennifer, if you would like to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Mark?
Yes.
All right. And I'll try sharing my screen again before I introduce myself. Just find out if I can get this working too.
Sure.
Looks okay?
Looks great.
All right. So I'm Jennifer Possley. I am the Conservation Program Manager at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. And I'm actually originally from a small town in Michigan called Dexter, Michigan, but I've been in Florida since the 90s. And I've been at Fairchild for about 20 years now. So much of that time I've spent working with our native ferns. And I'm really just here to tell you about our fern program, geek out about ferns with you, and to kind of take a look into the ferns that are special in Seminole County, who's hosting this meeting. So I'll take it from here. And I have to say, the Cuplet Fern chapter is I wasn't too aware of this chapter before giving this talk, but you guys are fantastically active and you're really admirable in how much you do. So you're something that we can aspire to be like down here in South Florida. It's awesome. So I'm going to talk for about an hour, and I have 5 sections of my talk. First up is why ferns. I'll talk a little bit about Fairchild's native fern program. My third section is fascinating fern biology. That's the super geeky part, and probably my favorite part of this presentation. I'm going to talk about some of the ferns of Seminole County. When I was invited to give this presentation, I thought, well, where is Seminole County and what kind of ferns do they have? And I did a little bit of research and was really interested in what you guys have there. And then I'm going to end off with tips on growing ferns that you can do even in your own home. So I will start off with why ferns. So the main reason why I got into ferns and why I'm speaking about ferns today is because we are in the ferniest state in the continental US. We're really in a fern hotspot. And this amazing map here is from the site bonap.org. They have these gradient density maps, and they have them for all different kinds of plants, but I just chose the fern one. And on this map, the bright blue shows the highest levels of diversity. You can see that Florida is very green and blue. We have more species of ferns than any state in the continental US. And if you zoom in on Florida, you see a little blue circle in my county, Miami-Dade, and that's the hot spot of the entire continental US, where there are 60 ferns in just this little area called the Miami Rock Ridge. And we don't have all of those ferns anymore, unfortunately. A good number of them have been extirpated, where they're perhaps not extinct globally, but they're extinct in Florida. But we do have 2/3 to 3/4 of them still here. And then Seminole County up here, you guys have in the 40s, which is still extremely high diversity compared to the rest of the United States. Where I am in Miami, we have an endemic hybrid, the Biscayne spleenwort, which is this beauty shown here. This is extinct in the wild, and the only place it's found in the entire universe, as far as we know, is in 2 Miami front yards, where the homeowners didn't fill the yards with fill like most of the yards in Miami. The natural rock outcropping is left, and there are remnant populations of this fern. This is not an endangered species. It has no legal protection. Endangered species do not include hybrids like this. And even if this was on the Florida endangered species list, that prevents it from harvest, but a homeowner can do anything on their own property. Here in Miami, we also have an endemic fern, a Florida endemic fern rather, and that's the Florida bristle fern. This really looks more like a liverwort. It's this tiny little thing that has little roundish leaves, and this is a filmy fern that's found in South Florida, and then it's also found up north, but in the Brooksville area. It has a strong affinity for limestone outcropping, and this is in 4 preserves in Miami, and it was recently, I think 2014, added to the Florida endangered species list. And then some other special ferns we have in my neck of the woods are these, what I call near endemics, because they're found only in Florida and in the greater Antilles, so like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. And that's the hollyvine fern, the stiff starhair fern, Wright's pineland fern, and modest spleenwort. So these are all some really special ferns that are still hanging on in the Miami's natural areas. And I believe all of them are restricted to South Florida, except the modest spleenwort is also found in North Florida in the Brooksville area, in those limestone grottos. So the reason why I personally got into ferns is 20 years ago, and actually it was 20 years ago this month, I accepted a job at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. I was fresh out of graduate school at the University of Florida. I'm a Florida Gator, and I was hired on a 6-month grant to map and monitor rare plants in Miami. And I spent a lot of time in the field. I was strictly a field biologist, and I found that most of the plants were quite well known. Everyone knew, oh, if you want to see this rare brickle bush, you have to go to Larry and Penny Thompson Park, etc. But there were a lot of rare ferns, and those were not very well known. And not only was it not well understood where they were found, but there wasn't a lot of expertise in the area at that time about how to identify these ferns. So like it or not, if I were to keep my job, I really had to start to learn to embrace ferns because there were so many rare ferns here where I was working. So I turned to the few resources I had available to me that I was very lucky to have. Keith Bradley was a local biologist with the Institute for Regional Conservation, and he literally went with me to some of these preserves where our ferns persist and showed me how to identify them and where they were located. Mr. Don Keller there in the center, he's no longer with us, but he was a longtime member of the Dade chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. That's our chapter mascot there, if you will, the cardinal air plant, or Tillandsia fasciculata. And I think that is the day when Don was awarded the Old Coot Award and lifetime membership, so that's why he looks so happy there. But he spent decades in Miami botanizing with a fern focus, and he was really the local expert. And I was able to interview him a couple times and glean some of his expertise. And then also I certainly owe thanks to Gil Nelson and his fantastic book, The Ferns of Florida, which is a really nice way to get introduced to the ferns of the state. And I especially, as I was getting familiar with this group of plants, I especially appreciated his sections on how to tell similar looking species apart from one another. So starting in the early 2000s, I just spent a lot of time crawling around in our tropical hardwood hammocks, looking in holes, taking pictures, and learning to identify these ferns that I was, soon to fall in love with, really. I got to go to places like Ross Hammock here, Camp Owassa Bower, and these are called fern grottos. They were written about in the early 1900s by J.K. Small and other early botanists. People came from all over the country to see the fern grottos of the Miami area. They were very beautiful, and they still are. Some of them are behind lock and key now. A few of them are accessible to the public. This is Fuchs Hammock, one of my favorites. That's the Florida tree fern there, Tinnitus sloanii. And our Hardy Matheson Preserve is right next to Fairchild Garden. It's a really spectacular limestone outcropping. And then you can see our Miami Rock Ridge. It's seriously rock. We have very little soil. It's all limestone, and we specialize here in limestone-loving ferns. I've also gotten to travel outside of Miami and learn about ferns in other places. Here I am in the Fakahatchee Strand next to the narrow strap fern and the long strap fern, both growing on the same, I guess, cypress knee or stump. And then I've been able to travel to Puerto Rico and do some work there with cooperators in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And here I had to take a selfie with this holly vine fern in the Lomariopsis genus, which I was just blown away by this thing. It was really beautiful. So over the years, working with ferns, we kind of almost without intending to started a native fern conservation program at Fairchild. And the goal of the program is to reduce the likelihood of extinction of South Florida's rare native ferns. And as part of the program, this is pretty much what we do. We go out and collect wild propagules, which is usually spores. And that's the funnest part, I have to say. We figure out how to grow them. We establish ex situ or off-site populations at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden, and these can act as kind of insurance against the native populations in case something were to happen. We would have backup at Fairchild. Something we do, not as much as we should, but we do occasionally, is send spores for long-term storage at the United States National Germplasm Repository in Fort Collins, Colorado. We have our own on-site seed bank at Fairchild, which is for seeds that are capable of storage, but ferns don't do well in conventional freezers. They do best in cryogenic storage. And then something we do increasingly over the last maybe decade is to take some of these ferns we've grown and reintroduce them back to the wild, either in places where they've disappeared or in suitable habitat within their native range. We've actually done this with quite a few species. As far as I can count, we've done introductions or augmentations with 9 different native fern species. I won't say they've all been successful. Most of them have had some measure of success. I think number 5, our Microgramma heterophylla is our climbing vine fern. That one's done fantastic. We've had the most difficulty with the first one, the fragrant maidenhair. And our most recent introduction, there's a little picture of it here. This is the modest spleenwort, Asplenium vericundum. And we tried something different with this species. We kept it in the pot, and you can see we used hardware to affix it to some mossy limestone. And we actually cut, you can't tell in the picture, but we cut away the backside of the pot. And then we're hoping this little guy will latch on to the limestone, and we can eventually remove the hardware and the plastic. So that was something that the Deering Estate Natural Area Manager, Dallas Hazelton, came up with. And so far, it's been working really well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fascinating fern biology, and I have to say I'm not a hardcore fern biologist. I think I'm coming at this kind of as more of an enthusiast, but I've had to learn a lot about fern biology over the years as I've been working with these species, and I'm just continually fascinated by ferns. I think they're really cool. So, as you may or may not know, ferns are vascular plants, just like flowering plants. They have vessels, but they are not flowering in that they don't have flowers, they don't have seeds, they have spores. And spores are just the perfect little dispersal mechanism. It's just a tiny little dust-like cell that can fly on the wind. They can even find spores up in the jet stream. They are pretty much everywhere on Earth. If you look on pages of the New York Botanic Garden, and I put a link below, you can find some really fantastic scanning electron microscope images by NYBG Professor Robin Moran, and gives you an idea as to what fern spores look like, and they're really strikingly beautiful. They are characteristic for the species, so you could learn to identify a species based just on its fern spores if you happen to have a scanning electron microscope handy to use whenever you wanted. This is an idea of what kind of variation you can see. Every single spore here is in the genus Elaphoglossum, and the variety just in this one genus is pretty crazy. And I went and I got the spores of the Cuplet fern, since this is the Cuplet fern chapter that's hosting me, the Dennstaedtia bipinnata. This is what Dennstaedtia spores look like. So thank you, Professor Moran, for these really cool images. So I just have a little bit of terminology because I'm going to be saying these words a lot through the rest of the presentation. Fern spores are born inside fern sporangia. So the sporangia are essentially little round containers full of spores. These sporangia are then often gathered into sori, which can look like polka dots. They can look like lines in some species. The word sori or singular sorus just means a cluster of sporangia. And then in some species, the developing sporangia are protected by indusia. And the indusium is just a piece of tissue that is part of the leaf that protects the developing sporangia. So I have 3 different examples of variation here. This is the narrow strap fern that has sori in little circles and no indusia at all. This halberd fern, the Tecteria heracleofolia, has what we call peltate indusia. The indusia are shaped basically like little umbrellas, with a circle and then a stalk in the middle, and that's protecting the developing sporangia. And then ferns in the genus Adiantum have a false indusium, whereas there's not really a special structure dedicated towards protecting the sporangia, but the leaf margin curls over and protects them as they're developing. So fern sporangia are just amazing things. And I'm going to expound on fern sporangia for a little bit. This image on the left shows just a typical piece of copy paper with a period at the end of a sentence, and then there's a single fern sporangium next to it. So you can see it's a little bit smaller than a period on a page. If you zoom in on that, and I got this great image from Wayne's Word, one of my favorite Botany Geek websites. Each sporangium is made out of a stalk, and then the wall that holds the spores inside, and the annulus, which is this line of cells that contract and forms sort of like a spine, and that serves to open and help to release the spores. We'll see if this works. I have an embedded YouTube video, which may be hit or miss. And this is, I pilfered this from the Martin Microscope Company because I thought it was the best one that I could find on YouTube. I didn't realize the music would be so loud. But watching fern spores release is really cool, and it's something that anybody can do. If you have a dissecting scope, it's easiest, but you don't have to. You could use a hand lens. As you pick ferns that are fertile and as they dry, the sporangia dry, they open up, the annulus contracts, and then to me, I always think it looks like little animals sneezing, and they blow big clouds of spores forward. So I'll play that a little bit more so you can see it. And one thing that at Fairchild, we have a really very active education program, and once in a while I do a workshop with kids talking about ferns, and I always get fertile fronds and dissecting scopes, and the best part is when the kids can see this under the scopes and they all start yelling like, "What is that?" It's fun and exciting. Next slide there. Okay. So anyway, also at Fairchild Garden, we have an imaging lab, and we're able to take some really great stacked photos. So close-up photos of 3D images that are then stacked together using a special software. And these the experts that do this do so on a volunteer basis. So Hank Poor was a volunteer who took these images for me. And these are sporangia on the underside of some phylipterous fronds. You can see, to me, these look like little patty pan squash, but they are the sporangia of phylipterous. And the ones that are brown have fully developed spores inside, and they're going to be opening soon. And then the light colored ones are still developing. So this is a look at the backside of swamp fern, where the sporangia are arranged in long lines. And in this case, the frond is old. The spores have already been released. And what you see here are the annuli that are left because the cell walls have kind of disintegrated and broken away. And then here's the false indusium of a fragrant maidenhair, Adiantum melanolucum, and you can just see that little edge of leaf tissue protecting the sporangia as they developed, although these have already released their spores and they're starting to kind of crumble up and dry up. And Hank got some just amazing images. I think this is my favorite one. This is a sorus made up of a bunch of sporangia in the long-strapped fern, Campyloneurum phyllididus. And this species has the most beautiful yellow spores. And when the sporangia are almost mature, they become clear and you can see the yellow spores through the wall. And this picture is so good that you can even see some of the stomata on the leaf surface, and you can see a couple of individual spores here and here. So if you don't remember all the way back to high school biology, you may not know how spores fit into fern reproduction. So I have a little refresher here for you. You might remember the phrase alternation of generations. But what the deal with ferns is they have two distinct life cycles that are completely independent of one another. So whereas with flowering plants, everything happens in one individual, with ferns, there's two separate individuals that complete the life cycle. And the sporophyte is what we think of as, when we all think of a fern, we're actually thinking of the asexual form of the fern's life. And it's called sporophyte, meaning spore leaf, because it makes spores from the leaves usually. And what happens when these spores land in an ideal spot is they germinate and grow into a gametophyte. So this is a tiny little plant that's about the size of your pinky nail. In most species, they're somewhat heart-shaped. And this is really where all the action happens in a fern's life. This is the sexual part of a fern's life cycle. Gametophytes produce sperm and egg. Sometimes the gametophyte will just produce eggs, sometimes it'll just produce sperm, and sometimes they're bisexual. But the sperm actually have flagella like animal sperm, and they will swim to a fertile egg and fertilize it. And then if everything is successful, the gametophyte will start to grow the first leaf of the sporophyte, and then the cycle will repeat itself. And fern sperm are really crazy and cool. Although they have a flagellum like animal sperm, it's not just one flagellum, they have multiple flagella. So they're really kind of a sea monster looking creature. And if you happen to be a teacher or know a teacher, there's actually a fern that's been patented for use in classrooms called sea fern. And you could purchase sea fern, and there are a lot of lesson plans and lab protocols available for using this fern. You could purchase spores, grow gametophytes, look at fern sperm under the scope, etc. It's a cool thing. And this is actually in the genus Ceratopterus, which is a genus that you guys have in Seminole County, but we don't happen to have in Miami-Dade County. And I would just point out that there are other plant groups that do have flagellate sperm. Ferns aren't the only ones. Cycads and ginkgos, for example, both have sperm with flagella. And I have a fern sperm video, which is not a very exciting video, but it's what you can expect to see if you wanted to look in a classroom. And you can hear all the kids talking. But when you don't have the benefit of a scanning electron microscope, this is what most of us have to use, and you can see the sperm swimming in any standard microscope. Okay, so my next section is for all of you members of the Cuplet Fern chapter up there in Seminole County. I've spent some time looking at the ferns that I believe are present in your county, although I've never been there in person yet. And it looks to me like you have 36 native species of ferns and fern allies, which is not too shabby at all. And you have 10 non-native naturalized species. And I have to stop and say that almost all of the information I'll be presenting from here on out in this section is from the Atlas of Florida Vascular Plants, which is an incredible resource that's online through the University of South Florida. And kudos to Professors Wonderland, Hansen, and Frank for making this resource available to all of us. It's a wonderful, wonderful one to have. And then I also gleaned a little bit of information from iNaturalist, and I'll talk about that when I get there. So I'll just take a brief mention of the non-native naturalized species that I believe are in Seminole County, not to give them too much screen time, but these are the 10, and out of these, there's 4 that I have highlighted in yellow that are considered to be non-native invasive pest plants that are invading and disrupting Florida's natural areas. So you're probably all familiar with the climbing ferns. They're a serious, terrible pest in all of Florida. And the tuberous sword fern and water spangles are as well. So these 4 yellow species absolutely have been shown to be displacing native species. But everything on this list is likely displacing native species if there are more than a couple of plants present. So I'd encourage you to learn to identify these and work to remove them if that's the appropriate thing to do. And I guess if you have permission to do so in the area where you see them. So of your 36 native species, I noticed some real differences between what you have and then what we have down here in Miami. Just like us, I suspect you have some extirpated species, and I'd really like to talk with any of you chapter members about that after the presentation. You have more aquatic species. You have 5 different aquatic species in these 4 genera, and you have more fern allies than we do. You have actually 3 species of Lycopodiella, whereas we have none. So that was interesting to me. But I'm really going to zero in on some of your true ferns that are terrestrial, because that's where my expertise lies. So that's where I get most excited about what you have up there in Seminole. So this is the southern grape fern, Botricium biternatum. And this is apparently not a super rare fern, but I've never seen it in my life. I think it's really cool looking. It's also called a moon fern. This is, from what I understand, a quite ephemeral wetland species. You might not recognize it at all, and many people, probably including myself, might even think it's a tree seedling if it didn't have that fertile frond on it. But this is one where if I was visiting up in Seminole County, I'd want to see this. Next on my list is you have on your inventory the brown hair comb fern. This is Tinnitus submarginalis, and I'm extremely interested in this because this is also one of the very rare species that we have in Miami. And in fact, that center picture is myself with the Deering Estate Natural Areas Manager, and that's about a year ago. We were doing an outplanting of, I think, 26 of these into the hammock at the Deering Estate. And I'm happy to report that all 26 of them are still alive. They don't all look great, but they're all hanging in there. And some of them do look quite great. But I've wondered if this species is extirpated in your county. There's only one voucher at USF from 1979. And of my small probably incomplete fern network. I haven't found anyone who's seen it recently in Central Florida where you are. I think these picluma, or these polypodes, are something really cool and special, and I'm jealous that you have them in Seminole County. We have them in Dade, but they're relegated to some remote hammocks in Everglades National Park. We don't have them in our urban natural areas. These are really cool species. That, to me, they just seem very tropical, and I don't have a picture that shows it, but they kind of shrivel up and look almost like an old telephone cord when they're dry, and then they kind of rehydrate in the rain, which is cool. Okay, I bet everybody who's in the Seminole County FNPS chapter recognizes this. This is the Cuplet fern, Dennstaedtia bipinnata. And I actually took these pictures in our nursery because I have the privilege of growing a couple of these. I did not grow it from spore. I was given a potted plant. And if you get a potted plant of this, boy, they grow really fast and they're very easy to grow. They're strongly rhizomatous and they can try to just bust out of the side of the pot. And you can see why it's called the Cuplet fern. The spores are built up into this little cup-shaped indusium, and they're developing in there, which is a very cute little structure. So this fern has a crazy distribution. Never was found in Miami, even though it's a tropical species. I don't know why it didn't end up here, but I guess it doesn't have a strong affinity for limestone like many of our ferns. It likes more wetland areas, from what I understand. But this is, kudos to the Cuplet fern chapter for naming your chapter after this fern, because it really is a special part of your flora, in my opinion. So talking about weird distributions, this one is really weird. I was very surprised to see that narrowleaf strap fern is on the list of ferns and fern allies for your county on the Florida Plant Atlas. This is a species that is now extirpated from Miami, and it's present, as far as I know, the only place it's present in Florida is the Fakahatchee Strand. This is a really charming species, and I found the voucher and the Florida Plant Atlas was collected in 1904 by Alva Eaton near Oviedo. So I'm really curious as to whether this is still present in Seminole County. And if it is, it would be one that's really important for us to try to establish an ex situ conservation collection, because it's so geographically isolated up here. And then I have the longstrap fern, Campyloneurum phyllotidis. This was not on the list for Seminole County, according to the Plant Atlas, but I saw on the iNaturalist site that a botanist named, whose screen name is @WhenLeafGivesYouLemons on iNaturalist, and who is probably an active member of the Cuplet fern chapter, actually documented this species in Seminole County, which is pretty cool. iNaturalist is so fun to use and so easy to use. I highly recommend it. It's increasingly a good way to find out botanical and distribution information about some of the plants you're working with. Oh, and I have just a side note, this is a longstrap fern in my backyard. I think this is an exceptionally pretty plant and really good in landscaping. I don't know why it's not used more. So there's my plug for longstrap fern. And then I think my last fern to highlight from Seminole County is your creeping bramble fern, Hypolepis repens, which has this funny distribution where it's only Central Florida, and then the Florida Keys, so I'm not sure what's up with that. But this is a fairly rare species in Florida, and I learned in making this presentation that it's possibly a Florida endemic species that's been hiding right under our noses all along, because a Brazilian scientist in 2018 published this manuscript where he described some new species of Hypolepis, and this was one of them. He said the Florida material is distinct from the other Hypolepis repens throughout the range because the leaves are much smaller and it has much fewer prickles. So he proposes naming this Florida endemic Hypolepis barringtonii. So we will wait and see if this is something that bears out. I think the Plant Atlas is still calling it Hypolepis repens, but it's something to keep an eye on. All right, so we're coming into the home stretch of my fern presentation, and I wanted to talk about growing native ferns. And I can't talk about growing native ferns without mentioning this guy who, if you're looking at the picture, you can tell he hates to have his picture taken, but this is the only one I have of him. This is Fairchild's former horticulturalist, Mike Friedman, who really taught me everything I know about growing ferns. He was really good at it. And apparently he was really big into growing ferns in the 70s, and he had been working at Fairchild since the 70s. And then he kind of just fell by the wayside. But when we started working with our local rare ferns more and more, we started to really lean on Mike to help to grow these things. And he was very generous with his time and shared a lot of his knowledge with me and with other Fairchild staff and volunteers. So thanks, Mike. I'm going to talk a little bit about propagation by spore, but I have to preface it to say that you don't have to propagate all ferns by spore. Some of them can be propagated in a much more easy way by division if they have a creeping rhizome. So not every single species has a creeping rhizome, but some of them do, like that Cuplet fern. It's so easy to just take a clean, sharp knife, cut through the rhizome, and where you had one fern, now you have two. And it takes like 5 minutes. Several of these other ferns I have listed here are also easy to cut through. I wanted to mention that you can do this with the Campyloneurum ferns as well. I didn't realize until I had been working with them for years that Campyloneurum species also are rhizomatous. The rhizome is just really short. But if you dig in there under the soil or the bark or whatever they happen to be growing in, there's a little rhizome you can cut through, and you can turn one fern into two. So propagating by spore is what we usually have to do because most ferns, they don't make it easy for us. And the process is to make a spore print, take those spores and sow them onto damp soil in a clear closed container, and then wait. You have to be really patient. This is not for someone who has 3 months to do a project. This is for somebody who's playing the long game. So I'll kind of illustrate the process for you. Spore prints are by far the easiest way to collect spores. You can't just go up to a fern and pull out some spores usually. You have to collect a fertile frond. And what I do is I lay it on white paper in an air-conditioned room, and usually within 24 hours, if you chose well, then it will have made a spore print. And this process has the added bonus that it is really beautiful and really fun. And when you pick up that kind of shriveled leaf and see the spore print underneath, it's just always a thrill. The hard part is selecting a frond that's at the right stage of development. And for this part, you really need to have a hand lens. And it also helps to know what color spores your fern is supposed to have. So for example, I know that the strap ferns in the genus Campulinurum have yellow spores. This Thelipterus reptans here has brown spores. And then this big picture is a Thelipterus sancta, where the spores are so dark they're almost black. And we know that when the sporangia are almost ready to release, they become clear and you can see the spores inside. So in order to pick a correct frond, you need to look for the spores that are inside and well developed. And it's tricky, it is. Even looking, I get it right about, 25% of the time. I have some examples of what not to do. If the indusia on your ferns are green and you don't see the sporangia, it's too young. You gotta wait. This is an example of a fern that has the sporangia are too old. The sporangium walls should be kind of clear like glass, and you should see spores inside them, but these are crumbly and empty. And then this is one that is just about right. This is an asplenium. This is actually, I think, a picture my dad took from our backyard in Michigan. And I don't know what species it is, except that it's an asplenium. And the aspleniums always remind me of tacos filled with ground beef. That's how I can remember the genus. But here you can really see those little brown sporangia that are full and ready to pop. And if you could zoom in and maybe heat them, they would start to look like this and snapping open and releasing their spores. So once you get spores, the next step is to sow them onto some damp soil in a container. And I have a little schematic of what to do. Starting at the bottom, you want to have just any inorganic material. And let me take a step back and say what you're really doing to grow your spores is to make a little miniature terrarium. So the best way to do that is in the bottom, have an inorganic material, and it can be rocks or perlite is what we use. And then you add some water to that level to serve as kind of a reservoir. And then on top of that, you spread some slightly damp, not wet, but slightly damp germination mix. And we use germination mix for growing seeds, and it's a very fine grain and has vermiculite in it. And then you just want to be careful that you don't have this right at the top of the container. You need room for your spores to grow. Here's a couple of examples. Once you get your container ready, you need to add some spores and then keep it in bright but indirect light. So if you have a windowsill that's not in direct light, that's often a great place. And since we live in South Florida, I'd say do it in an air-conditioned room. You don't want your container to be too warm, or it's going to have an overgrowth of algae and fungus and yucky stuff. And don't forget the label. It's very important. You might think you will remember, but it could be several years before you reap your harvest, so don't count on your memory. What we do at Fairchild is we use these deli containers, and we're fortunate to be able to kind of glom on to the garden's very successful Million Orchid Project, which is an effort to grow native orchids for introduction all over South Florida. And these are the containers that they use to grow the young orchids. And they also, we've found, work great for ferns. And we're growing nowhere near 1 million ferns. We just use a little bit. And we grow them on these racks that have fluorescent lights. And they do quite well. This is an example of some Asplenium erosum that we sowed, I think, 2017. And these were collected from Withlacoochee State Forest by biologist Colleen Werner. And on the left, I'm looking into the deli container to take this picture. And these are little clusters of fern gametophytes. And you can see right here at the top at about 12 o'clock, there's these gametophytes have started to make the sporophyte, and this is the first leaf of the next generation, that sporophyte generation. And I'll tell you, I think these pictures are from 2018, and the ferns that we have right now have graduated to being in plugs. Some of them are still in the deli container, and the biggest one is about 2 inches tall. So you really have to be very patient, especially with some of these rare species. Oh, and I also wanted to add, there's a way you can cheat if you're interested in growing ferns. And this is something that I use at home and at work. If you have a fern that is fertile and you know it's dropping spores, set it in the shade near a rock, a limestone chunk, or some moist soil. And before too long, you'll have your own little baby fern factory starting. This picture I actually took in my backyard, and I had maidenhairs growing, and you can see gametophytes growing on this chunk of rock, and then the first leaf of the sporophyte is starting to grow. So I have not been able to see the chat during this talk, but that's probably good because it probably would have distracted me. I'm really happy to take questions when this at the end of this. And I just wanted to say, for the take home, I hope I conveyed that ferns are a really fascinating and variable plant group. Florida is a fern diversity hotspot, and I do feel that our native ferns deserve more attention, and they should be grown more and appreciated more. Here at Fairchild Garden, we're working with a lot of different cooperators, a lot of different experts to prevent the extinction of South Florida's native ferns. And then we should all have more ferns in our gardens. Oh, and finally, acknowledgements. We've had a lot of different funders over the years, depending on where our ferns have come from, but by far the biggest have been Miami-Dade County Parks, Recreation, and Open Spaces. In the past, Miami-Dade County Environmentally Endangered Lands Program was a huge supporter. The state of Florida, the Endangered Plant Advisory Council, and we've also had some private donations, which has been great. And I'd like to thank these other cooperators, some of whom I've mentioned, but I hadn't mentioned before, the Cincinnati Zoo and Marie Selby Botanical Garden. Both of those groups have helped us early on to start propagating some of our rarest species. And the Cincinnati Zoo may be surprising to you, but they have a Center for Conservation and Research on Endangered Wildlife. And Dr. Valerie Pence there does amazing things with plants, and they're really on the cutting edge of plant propagation and very good at propagating hard-to-grow ferns. And then finally, I'd like to thank my mentors, Keith, Don, and Mike, and Fairchild volunteers who've helped to make a lot of this happen, especially Ty, Tatiana, and Isabel. And one last thing, if you're on Instagram, I have an account that's dedicated just to ferns, so you can follow me at ferny.sofla. And that's it. Oh, these are my recommended books too. That's my final slide.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm just typing in a comment here. So folks, those of you who are viewing this, please keep in mind that Jennifer is a researcher. She does this for a living. Do not go out and poach endangered plants. That is illegal, unethical, and we are unexperienced. You know, we may have all the right intention in the world trying to propagate a very rare fern, but chances are it's not going to work in our hands, and it's going to work in people like Jennifer's hands that, you know, really know how to propagate and have the experience to grow endangered ferns. So please do not attempt to propagate our endangered ferns. They are protected by law, especially on natural land property. We'll take some questions now. Let me just scroll up. Folks, now is a good time to write in your questions away, and we can take them at this point. All right. So Susan Socks writes, what is the longest you've had to wait to collect spores to grow into gametophytes?
Good question, and I never know how long it's going to take. I think the quickest we've had is maybe spores germinate within a week. We have gametophytes that turn into sporophytes in about 3 months. But I have some ferns, like in the genus Lomariopsis, where I've been waiting about 15 years and they still have not formed sporophytes. So, yeah.
I did see that post. They love to stay as baby gametophytes, don't they?
Yeah, they're my Peter Pan ferns.
Very good. Christy Wilson writes, I live in Brooksville. Are there certain areas to look for ferns?
Christy, I don't know. I know I've not visited any of the fern areas. I know that many of the hot spots where some of these really special ferns were documented by John Beckner from Selby Gardens and others have since been developed. And I am just completely in the dark as to whether or not there's still good fern habitat up there. So if maybe somebody in the chat can enlighten me. I don't know.
Yeah, we were enlightened by some of the rare ferns that you highlighted during this presentation. I was chatting with Jennifer before we went live. We were going to study and monitor our beautiful Cuplet ferns here up in Seminole County, but there are some other ferns that really require closer attention, and we might encompass that as part of our research here as well. Let's take another question. Jonathan Edward writes, Jennifer, I have a few southern shield ferns, I guess that's a Philipterus species, in my yard. Is there anything I can do to help them spread, or are they best left alone?
If in my experience, in the right habitat, that fern can be almost weedy. If you give it dark, moist habitat, it will spread on its own. But you can help to speed up the process by perhaps digging it up, cutting it along the rhizome, because it does have a creeping rhizome, and separating it into several plants that you could plant around your yard. So it would, in the right conditions, it could make a really attractive low ground cover.
I agree. And Jonathan, in my yard, they just donated themselves. So one day I stopped mowing that area of my lawn. Another reason and the unimportance of mowing lawns is that natives start donating themselves back into your yard. And southern shield fern was one of them. So it was a pleasant surprise to encounter one. And yes, Jennifer's right. You get the right conditions and they can get a little bit weedy. Carol Bradford writes, is your germination mix peat-based okay for limestone type ferns?
I have found that all of the ferns so far, maybe not all of them, but the majority of the ferns I work with, they tend to specialize as only growing on rocks or only growing on as an epiphyte on rotten stumps or logs, but they all seem to do fine in germination mix to start. I think I can't completely explain why, but it seems like as long as you give them the right light and moisture conditions, they're happy.
Very good. Rory is a Cuplet Fern member. He writes, can I move my royal / cinnamon ferns easily? I saw an expert on Monty Don assert that Osmunda tree ferns roots are at the top of the trunk.
Oh man, I don't know the answer to that. I would say it would be very important in my mind to get everything below the surface. And but we have Both species of Osmunda are actually really rare in Miami, so I don't have much experience with them.
Very good. Rory continues to add, I'm thinking of cutting some Osmunda, or it's actually spelled with an S, trunks off at ground level and placing them in an adjacent open shaded area. I have dozens of these in my lakeshore bald cypress grove. So I do know Rory, he does have a wetland style backyard. So he's trying to, enhance it by replicating the cinnamon ferns that are in his backyard. Any advice for him on that? Cutting off the trunks at the ground level?
It sounds like you're getting ready to do an experiment, and I'd like to hear the results. It sounds interesting.
Right. Linda Steele writes, any comments on resurrection fern?
Oh, it's a really cool part of our flora. As I work at Fairchild Garden, I get to drive down Old Cutler Road, and there's all these old oak trees that are covered with resurrection fern, and they unfurl every time it rains. It's a species that is rather iconic for Florida. And I guess I'll say something that I learned recently about it is that there's actually a second species, the tropical resurrection fern, that's present in just the Florida Keys. This is something that Alan Frank brought to my attention. So this is the one that's in most of Florida is Pleopeltis polypodioides, correct? And then the one, do I have it backwards? I have it backwards.
You do.
Okay, the one that's in most of Florida is Michoii, Pleopeltis michoiana. And then in the Keys, Pleopeltis polypodioides is the tropical resurrection fern. So we actually have two in Florida, which is, I just learned.
And Kimberly Warner writes, I had a resurrection fern and another that looks like native pop up on an exotic palm. I was going to get rid of it. Is there a way to transfer them to save, or should I keep the non-native sago since the native ferns volunteered on the trunk? What would be most beneficial?
I think if you want to keep them, you should. If you want to keep them, but you want to lose the sago, I would take a saw and take that part of the sago trunk and then keep that. The fern will continue to live on the trunk, but if you try to transfer the fern, it's probably not going to make it.
It's tough. Yeah, it's tough. You'll have to take a decent size of that sago off and then adhere that portion of the sago that the fern is growing on onto another tree, a native tree in that instance. Ellie has another question for you, Jennifer. Are there any weeds or herbs that are helpful to grow near or under native Florida ferns that will aid in soil health or keep spiders and other bugs away?
That's another I don't know. She stumped me. What about you, Mark?
I'm not really sure. I think like ferns have a mind of their own. If they're happy, they're happy.
Yeah.
And they don't really require any special care. They are niche specific, but once they find their happy place, they're happy. Just leave them alone, I guess.
I really like having spiders and bugs in my yard, I have to say, because to me, that's biodiversity and a sign that I'm doing something right. So if I am messing around with my ferns and there's a spider or a bug, I tend to just kind of brush it out of the way and go about my business.
Right. Well said. Steve Collins writes, is there a good way to eradicate a suburban yard from invasive ferns to prepare an area for native fern propagation?
I would, if you are able to, I would definitely try to scrape away the top few inches of soil. There can be, spores can form a soil seed bank. And I don't know what species you have, but chances are that there's either spores or some part of fern rhizome down there. So I think scraping away soil is my best piece of advice for Steve.
Just to deplete that spore bank, I would assume would be the way to go. So folks, if there's any other questions, now is the time. I'm going to plug Florida Native Plant Society right now. If you happen to be in our area that we serve Seminole, West Volusia, extreme north, Brevard County, all of the North Orlando suburbs that bleed into Seminole County. So go to fnps.org. That's floridanativeplantssociety.org/join. And when you drop down through the chapters, you can select Cuplet Fern from there. We are on Facebook and Instagram. I know Jennifer is very active on Instagram. Please follow her. But our handles are exactly the same. They're just Cuplet Fern. Just do a standard search, and we should be usually the only search result since we have such an unusual name. The New York Times can be found here. It is actually this week that they mention Cuplet Fern as well as Jennifer and Fairchild Tropical. So if you want to check out their newsletter for New York Times at Home, that is the link, and it should be available only for this week until it gets refreshed for next week. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. I could not stress this enough. So we're a little nonprofit up here in Central Florida, and just clicking on that subscribe button, that's a free and very effective way of supporting our little nonprofit. So I would really recommend that. We have tons of videos. We have webisodes, webinars, stuff about bats, stuff about moths, and more things in the works. So please subscribe and support us. That would be, something that I would personally be very appreciative of. And Ann Cusack writes, how do I identify fern types in my area? She's in New Jersey.
I don't specifically know of any books. There may be some great books in your area. One thing that I've been getting into that is really fun is iNaturalist. And that's something where you can post pictures of ferns that you're trying to identify, and you don't need to have any idea what they are. You can rely on others on the app to identify them for you, and that's something that's fun, and it also gets you to know other plant people.
Wonderful. Yep, I agree. So with that, Jennifer, any parting words before we close this wonderfully received live stream to an end?
I just wanted to say thanks for inviting me. You've been an excellent host, and it's been cool to get to know Seminole County a little bit better and your fern flora. So
don't be a stranger. And with the magic of technology, we're just a phone call or a text message away. And we look forward to sharing our data with you, especially on ferns, the eponymous name for our Florida Native Plant Society chapter here.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This concludes our live stream, and we will see you next weekend. Have a good one.
Bye, Mark.
Bye-bye.